This visualization you see up here shows some of the activity in Kirk, ranging from the many tracks on the People Network to working in interest groups, to some operations groups that support the Kirk activities. So the Kirk People Network is really a year-round virtual conference, and we record the calls and we put them up on a Kirk YouTube channel. You can find a bunch of really great stuff there if you go up there. It ranges from the data-facing track with a host of data-related topics, researcher-facing, focusing on consulting and facilitation and such. Emerging centers, which has a lot of overlap between us, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Systems facing is one that probably most people understand the best. It's traditionally associated with engineering, the systems that we build, and then our new track on strategy and policy facing, focusing on things like leadership, institutional alignment and culture, funding, partnerships, and engagement with external communities. We also have a lot of working groups that take on projects that produce concrete results. And these activities range from the professionalization working group, which has built a job family framework, as well as the survey last fall to understand the demographics of our community, the closely related career arcs working group that is also exploring how do people make decisions about their careers in research computing and data. The capabilities model working group built an assessment tool that is used by many institutions to understand where they stand and what things they might or not be thinking about in their programs, and to benchmark themselves against a national community. And then in the engagement working group, which is coordinating with various groups to increase visibility and participation. And I should mention there's a couple of interest groups that have spun up recently. A decadal survey interest group is working on a decadal survey, kind of like what science domains do. And then there's a staff and student workforce development interest group that supports current and potential RCD professionals, curating leading practices for onboarding, training, and professional development. So we really encourage you all to get involved. There's mailing lists. You can come to the events like this one. There's easy ways to get involved in any of the groups. And so you can follow the links here. You can go to the website and find more information. I want to mention, looking ahead, our discussions are always going to be first Wednesdays at this time slot, 9 a.m. Pacific, noon Eastern. In just about a month, we're still confirming this, but we're planning to do reports back and discussion of topics from some of the recent national meetings of our peer organizations. So not all of us can get to all of these meetings, and this is a chance to talk about what came up. We'll have folks who've been to CASC, the EDUCAUSE conference, including the Research Computing and Data Community Group there. And then Melissa's going to be going to the cybersecurity conference, I believe, and we'll be able to talk about that. And we're still thinking about what we're going to do in December. And that's some of what you guys can help us out with today. So today, mostly we really want to welcome everybody to the group, and we really appreciate you showing up and joining us. We really want to explore what we can do with this track. Okay, we have some of our own ideas that have come from our steering committee and others, and we use those to sort of spur the discussion, but we're interested in hearing from you all. With that, I do want to thank the steering committee members that are helping us out with this: Ann Kowalczyk, Carolyn Ellis, Claire Mizumoto, Jackie Milhans, Jen Schultz, Jim Wilgenbush, Melissa Cragen, and I, who are coordinating this, Preston Smith, Rich Knepper, and Vesela Ensberg. Thank you all. You guys are really going to help make this happen. So with that, here's some of the ideas that we've come up with. And I just want to share these, as I say, to spur discussion, and then we'll stop with the presentation and go into just a discussion. So we've heard from people that there's a lot of interest in just exploring some of the issues associated with leadership. So how do you write a good impact report? How do you map an influence network and build up good value propositions for your key stakeholders, which is really about how do you influence people to help support the organization or to bring about changes when you're trying to do that? Where do you go for yourself and your team to get management and leadership training, and what programs have people been in that they thought were actually really valuable? And then a bunch of finance topics. How can we share resources across centers? What are the issues associated with that? Colors of money and things like that. Recharge models and what goes on with them. Models for overhead distribution and what the implications are for your program funding. And then basically just how to speak to finance teams. How do you develop that language about how to work with them effectively? And then, for example, like what we're doing in November, we recognize that not everybody can get to all the meetings, and it'd be great to hear from our peers about what happened and what was interesting that went on at some of the other meetings that go on in our community. A big topic that comes up again and again, what are the implications of how your unit is organized and on your campus? Do you report to a CIO, or do you report to a VPR or something else? It's more complicated. And then individual topics as they come up, like supporting regulated research and sensitive computing and data. And one of the things that I want to mention is, some of these topics are also have been covered and continue to be of interest in the emerging centers track. And in some cases, this is intentional. We've been working very closely and have benefited from all the experience of the chairs there, Rich Knepper and Jane Combs. And we've been talking about how in some cases, we may actually want to take the same topic from two lenses, where they'll look at it from a more operational standpoint, perhaps, and then we can look at it from a more strategic standpoint. We'll see how cleanly that divide happens, but it's been great working with Jane and Rich. They've done a ton of really good topics in their track. And so in some cases that overlap is in fact intentional. So with that, I want to stop the share and open up the discussion. So which of those topics appeal to people? Which are the ones you're really keen to have us explore? And what other ideas have you got? Please jump in. Don't be shy.
Patrick, I have a question. This is Catherine Kelly from CASC. So you were mentioning the Emerging Centers track. What are the topics that they've been discussing that might be a good launching point for this group?
So let me go and find their track info. So if you go to their website on the Kirk site, I just put that into chat. You can see they actually list, they're a little bit out of date at this point, but you can get a good idea of some of the things that they've been talking about. They've got to update their site. You can also look back over the events calendar or go to the Kirk YouTube channel, and I'll dig that up and we'll add that as well. But they have been looking at a lot of topics. They do focus a little bit more on sort of what does it take to bootstrap a new center, and what are the things you're most concerned with early on. Are there Scott or Jane on the call? Excuse me, Scott, Rich or Jane on the call? Not today. They may have had a conflict.
So Patrick, I'm on that steering committee, so I'm happy to step in and say a couple of things. So, so this month on the 19th, we're talking about the cultural fit between research IT and like campus IT. And there's a lot of policy issues, embedded in that, like how they work together, whether they share common hardware or they don't, or common data center. So just within that, that's one thing coming up that we're talking about. The other thing we've been talking about is kind of how emerging centers emerge. And there's a lot of policy things in that, like, is it a single researcher that kind of does a lot of computation and then it grows into a research community? Is it something more top down where the university decides to make an investment and buys a lot of hardware and then finds people to use it? So those are just two instances of things that we've been talking a lot about in our steering committee meetings and trying to guide our future meetings towards that have a lot of policy embedded in them and strategy.
Thanks, Patrick. That's a good example. And I will say we're still sort of figuring out how to do that collaboration. So we'll get better with it. Get better at it over time, I'm sure.
So one of the things that I noticed in the slide you had, and I apologize, I came in a few minutes late, but and that I find very exciting is that there's a significant amount of overlap between what was in that slide and what we've covered at the advanced level in the virtual residency and also in the Cyber Infrastructure Leadership Academy. So I think there's a really good opportunity here to get some convergence, particularly because excuse me, both the Leadership Academy and the virtual residency, the topic choices are driven by the community. So we poll the community to ask what are the topics of interest at a particular level. And then we try and build content around the most, well, let's say the highest priority topics according to the community. And I think we can get a lot of value by taking advantage of those synergies.
Oh, absolutely. And thank you, Henry. I really appreciate you joining and talking about those programs, both of which I've heard great things about. And we would love to figure out, how we can support what you're doing and how, you can share some of what you're learning there. There's a slightly related topic. A year ago, summer, we had a workshop at Kirk where, among other things, we discussed what would people like to see in terms of resources to support them doing this kind of work. And some of it would be, pointers to like training programs, of the sort that Henry was just talking about. But also people asked for examples of a number of the things that I mentioned on the slides. Can you give me an example of a survey, a satisfaction survey you did for your researchers? Or can you give me an example of an impact report you had? Or has somebody ever written up a use case of how you did onboarding of new people and things like that? So that's some of what, longer term, what I'd like to see some of these discussions lead to is how do we capture some of the good practices and document them in a way so that folks can go read about and try to learn how to replicate what has worked well at other institutions. Or if they're looking for, how do I find a good program for training? And they know about the stuff that Henry mentioned and some of the others that are available, things like that. So it's some of what the RCD Nexus, which is a NSF-funded Center of Excellence, is working towards, is gathering more of those resources so that there's a place for people to find things. And in many cases, it'll just be pointers to all the good work that other folks are doing. But in some cases, we're finding there's gaps where people would like to see something written down. Go interview somebody and say, how did you do this? And help write it up and clean that up and share it with folks. Others, what would you like to see discussed, or what would you like to get out of the discussions that we could hold here?
Patrick? Oh, sorry, Annalie, you go.
No, go ahead, Lisa.
Oh, I was just going to suggest that we kind of reframe the question as our current pain points, because that does indeed seem to be what we all would want to talk about. I know for me, it's, building an argument for a massive investment in, research, data, and infrastructure. And, that's something that I'm working on with a team at UCLA. It's, unknown as to whether or not we'll be successful. So, that's something that I would be interested in talking about.
Yeah, I can imagine. I know several others in the community who are working on that too. So, Annalie, yes.
I was thinking it might be interesting to also talk at some point about how does governance factor into, how does it connect in with policy and even strategy sometimes, and particularly policy. So governance and policy are often connected at the hip. So government, maybe, hearing from different examples of different institutions of where there's governance and where there isn't, or where there's need for more, and how it intersects with the policies that are being formed or shaped or whatever. I think that would be interesting.
Absolutely. Melissa, you had we were talking just before the call, because to be honest, within Kirk, actually, the leadership and policy functions within Kirk have realized we need to put together a data governance activity for the data that we're gathering, everything from who's attending all these calls to some of the more sensitive data we're getting out of surveys and things. And Melissa was talking about a panel that's coming up that I think is interesting.
Sure. One of the things I know you all are familiar with the idea that in places the data governance activities existed very often is really focused on the enterprise data or administrative data, and doesn't often also include research data. So we're starting to see a couple of instances where that is starting to intersect, and so GoFair US, which is a volunteer and distributor organization, is collaborating with the Data Curation Network to put a panel together. I think we'll probably run it the end of November, early December. That panel will include people who are working at that intersection of data governance and data policy across several campuses. And I'll make sure that we post that, that event out. We don't have the date and time yet. I actually have a call this afternoon to kind of get those things nailed down. And yeah, so some of you know Lisa Johnston, who was at Minnesota. She's now at Wisconsin-Madison, and her job is Director of Data Governance, and it is including research data. And so she's someone else that might be a real nice resource going forward.
Yeah, thanks. There's a couple of notes that people added to the session notes, which I really appreciate. I wonder if anybody wanted to speak up and describe any of those, like the Compute Canada comments.
I suppose I should speak to that since I'm the one that typed that in. Yeah, I think from 2012 to 2019, we collected the journal articles where the Compute Canada equipment had been referenced in the article, and then they did field weighted citation indices to watch how people that used the infrastructure actually had higher citations than people who didn't. Particularly noticeable in digital humanities, obviously a lot less so in theoretical physics or something like that. So it was a way to show back to not only to the researchers, but also to the funders how the use of some of that equipment directly, drove some of the referencing of those articles in future work.
Yeah, that's a really nice example. There was a column, I'm trying to remember which track it was on in the past couple of weeks, that started out talking about XDMod and using that to track resources, and ended up morphing into or included a discussion about exactly the kind of things you're talking about, Scott, of ways of capturing information and what was really effective in terms of describing the impact, ranging from those kinds of metrics to basically golden quotes, influential researchers who had something really nice to say, and how effective those were, frankly, even above and beyond all of the metrics. So anything else? What other comments do people have? I see some other things coming in. Other people have interests on impact reporting. On that pain points issue. Oh, sorry, somebody.
So I have one, which is one of my kind of ongoing things, but I think, there are arguments that this could be in the professionalization or the career arcs area, but I think that we need people at the kind of strategic level really thinking about and finding ways that we can diversify the workforce in this area. We need to be thinking about ways to reach into high schools and community colleges and really getting a much broader, if I look at all the pictures here, it is representative of what we see at all these things. It's a very white community, and I think we need to do whatever we can to increase the number of underrepresented minorities and make it a more welcoming place for everyone, including women and such.
Thank you very much for bringing that up, Kurt. We had a very spirited discussion. It was a great discussion at our steering committee meeting about how do we learn more about this? As you point out, a lot of the folks that are currently involved in this tend to be white. A lot of us are male. Fortunately, we're getting more and more women involved, we're making some progress on that side. But figuring out how do we act more effectively as allies, educate ourselves more, I think that's so important. Ray, you had your hand up.
Sure, Patrick, thanks. I dropped a note in about the finance or in your introductory remarks there about all the different topics that we might go over. It felt like you were reading my job description because I have all of those in spades, but the finance is the one that I'm finding interesting and challenging just as we're developing some things on campus. I've already had, you mentioned colors of money. We've already had problems where it's not insufficient funds. It was just how do you get the funds moved from one place to another, or how do you account for efforts? And we're finding that that's stalling the project as much as anything having to do with technology or staffing or anything else. It's just several different groups, each of whom have their own budgets and control, their own money. How do you bring that together, and then how do you organize transfers? I think that's an important part to look at for this group.
Yeah, I think most of us have probably been through that at some point or another, and figuring out how to deal with that, what strategies people have used. It's another one where my sense is that hearing stories of how others have approached this is one of the most useful things. But we'll see if maybe we can also identify some resources. Maybe somebody has heard about trainings or introductions about how to get ourselves bootstrapped into that. I know a good friend of mine who was the CIO at Berkeley when I was there talked about all of his engineering background, and what he really had to do as he rose up was actually get some finance training so that he could speak effectively to the finance teams. If you can speak effectively to them, they can be your friends, and if you can't, it can often be a source of tension. So I think it's a great point.
Yeah, you nailed that there. It is a language. I think it's a language translation problem.
Yeah, often. Henry, you got your hand up.
Yeah, I want to circle back to the DEI issue real quick. One of the things that I think the community could do but has not done is to study efforts that have had significant success in that area to determine what are the factors that lead to success. So look at the various organizations and initiatives, find out what their numbers are, and then the ones that are achieving higher numbers than the community as a whole. And I kind of use as my baseline the SC conference. Unfortunately, they only post percent of women, and it's 13 to 14% each year. But use that as a mechanism. I mean, do some kind of reasonably formal study and ask people, why do you participate in that activity? What is it about that activity that makes it attractive?
Yeah.
Because we haven't to date had any study of that kind, and I think that would be incredibly valuable.
It's a good point. There are folks who have started looking at this, and I think there's folks who are much more sophisticated about this. The hardest thing is they're often incredibly busy, and it's hard to get their time and benefit from their expertise, but we're trying to figure out how to do that more. I'm thinking of some of the folks that have been involved in Exceed and elsewhere.
Are you talking about like Lizanne DeStefano, for example?
For example, or I'm going to screw up her name.
Sustainable Horizons Institute now comes to mind, and that's where Linda Ackley is now.
That's
I'm sure you've all seen 5 emails about their fellowship program.
Yeah, there's some individual institutions. As I work with a lot of campuses around the country, I've encountered some where they've done a very good job with outreach, and as a result have managed to diversify their population within an institution. And I think, even at the institutional level, in some cases, building on what you were saying, Henry, looking at practices that actually have been effective. And I think some of it is going to where folks are instead of simply trying to be welcoming. That's my impression, but I do not want to present myself as an expert on this. I feel like I'm still struggling to figure this out. But there are a lot of conferences in communities where people of color and others are gathering. And I think we need to do more to engage there to make it clear that we're really interested in engaging with them and not simply say, if you show up, we'll be nice. So, John, you've got your hand up.
Yes, John Highmaster, Ohio State. I like to point out that research computing is much broader than high performance computing. Laboratory instruments, field instrumentation, a whole variety of services. And I know that Ohio State's biggest expenditure on research computing is not the State Supercomputer Center, it's graduate student support. And, you know, support a graduate student costs us $60,000 a year. Ohio State has 11,000 graduate students. At least 10% of them are doing computer data intensive work. That's $60 million. If I can improve them by 10%, that's the size of the Supercomputer Center's operating budget. So I'm very concerned that we not lose sight of all these other populations. And networking, both physical and human, making these people productive, finding ways of training them, giving them expertise. That is every bit as valuable as optimizing supercomputing. Now, I chair the hardware committee for our supercomputer center, so I'm big on supercomputing. But the reality is that that isn't where the money's going.
It's a great point. I think Kirk is often feels sometimes, I think, almost like we're the underdog trying to champion the cause, the people who are involved in this. In many cases, it's professional staff, but as you point out, a tremendous number of the people are in fact graduate students, graduate student researchers, and there's at least some activity that is really interested and excited about working with those folks to help them be aware that there are careers other than on the faculty track, because not all graduate students are going to become faculty. Some of them would really like to stay in academia. Figuring out how to make clear to them how they could continue to contribute once they have their degree is something that I know that a lot of people are interested in.
And I'm very concerned with research competitiveness that flows from the productivity of all of these people at the edges, because that's what allows us to actually fulfill our contracts.
How would you like to see
it's easier to do supercomputing than it is this.
Yeah. How could we, what kind of discussions would you like to have us explore?
I don't know. I'm frustrated that we concentrate all our effort on one facet.
Yeah.
And I find struggling graduate students, I find struggling faculty. You know, I'm an experimental physicist. The oldest physicist grew up with computing. The oldest biologist did digital humanities. Hardly anybody grew up with computing. How do we make these people productive?
Well, it's a great question. And I will actually say, I feel like to some extent that also links back to, or at least my belief is it links back to the topics that Kirk brought up. A couple of people have heard one of my rants that if you start from the perspective of focusing on the diversity of domains that you're trying to support with your group, where you really make sure that you're not just supporting the computational physicists, but that you're actually going after all the departments, including the social sciences, the life sciences, and humanities, that in order to support them effectively and bring people from those domains onto your team, you will end up actually getting more demographic diversity, because the folks who are in the social sciences and the humanities aren't all older white guys, the way a lot of the physicists are. And so, you know, some of it is aligning all the different priorities and recognizing that, okay, sometimes you go after one thing and you can benefit something else.
Well, I don't know what the best way is to proceed in this area, but I want to follow up and see if we can find ways to strengthen our hand in our respective campuses in these areas.
Yeah, it's great. Thank you. Matthew.
Yeah, I wanted to build off John's point, because that's certainly something we're grappling with as well. Like, we're seeing areas like psychology being expected to handle multi-terabyte data sets with no computing science background amongst the folks that are actually performing the research. And the discussions we see from the folks developing solutions, there's kind of a dichotomy there. There's half the folks that are like, oh, we need to integrate HPC into the curriculum and teach them. And then there's half the folks that are saying, well, no, let's take the computer science knowledge we have and build solutions that work for them rather than dumping new education on their plate. So perhaps that's something we could tackle on that kind of policy leadership side, is how we kind of encourage that discourse and guide it, and work with our research community to understand their needs and meet them somewhere, not necessarily halfway, but maybe even a little bit further.
That's a really interesting idea, Matthew. Thank you. Bob.
Yeah, I was going to try and go the whole meeting without saying anything, and that Matt, thank you for that comment, because it was it's like, wow, this is my world. It's very interesting to see the perspectives on these sorts of problems, especially introducing high-end computing to what we used to call the long tail years ago, is those disciplines that are not used to using high-end computing resources. And having been on the front lines for this for now 6 to 8 years, I see a couple of patterns. I'll just say, it's the users need more training, which to some degree is right, but at the same time, do we really need to teach researchers how to build the car engine, or how to all the mechanics of a car engine, or is it more important for them to understand the various components and how they work? On the flip side, I think, and this is something that I do think is really important, is I think my boss always says people, process, tools. I think the tools ends up being sort of the last piece of that. And for reaching out to new disciplines, I think it's really there seems to be more success if one builds bridges to new communities instead of actually meeting the community and taking them over to where you live. And so really thinking very holistically is, how do we enable people to do their work in new and creative ways? And how do we empower them to do their research and use all these high-end tools, even from their desktop? And so they spend less time retooling and rejiggering all their research, just so that they can actually now utilize the tools in more and broader ways to be able to extend and accelerate the research. So I think really changing that conversation is a very important mindset, especially within the IT community, because it's like, oh, let's build another system. Like, well, I'm not really sure that's what we need. And so I think that's an important conversation to have, is like, well, if we want to approach this to be more diverse, more equitable, and it's actually an accessibility and equity thing as well. If complex people are building complex systems, it raises the bar of entry. It's not even for everyone. So let's see what we can do to simplify, make it intuitive, and not just all the terminal wonks, self-processed one, so that everybody can use these tools.
It's a good comment. It reminds me of back in the day, the standard refrain when somebody complained about some software was, well, it was hard to build, it should be hard to use. And fortunately, we're getting past that. But I know there's a movement to build more portals. There's a philosophical debate about whether that's the right approach. And how much do you hide and standardize, and how much do you let people actually explore? And are people actually using tools, or are they developing tools? Because those are two threads of activity within research. And so you're right, it's a really interesting discussion. I think it's the right kind of discussion we could have and explore, and possibly think about some of the people like the SGCI people who are working on portals, and what are they hearing about the development of that and its impact on research. Scott.
Yeah, I think our approach to having the equivalent of a summer school 3 times a year allows people to jump on at any point. If you got a master's student and all you offer is summer schools, they get 2 chances to learn how to use the tools available, whether they're in computing science or philosophy. And drinking from a fire hose just makes them wet, mad, and confused. Doesn't really help. And when we offer it 3 times a year, we say, do not feel the need to sign up for absolutely every session that we're offering now in September, October, because we're going to be back in late January, early February, and again in late April and May. And so you can take a session, learn how to use the tools that you see there, and then grow over time, rather than trying to internalize all these things on perhaps a command line. Other times it's not, and it's just, not terribly helpful. Not everything's aimed at people who need to code Python either. A lot of people use common tools now, and that helps with the adoption of a champion in a field saying, it's really not that bad. Whether it's, Voyant tools for textual analyses, or something a bit more complicated in particle physics, but, they can help each other along, which is why I've hired a community of interest coordinator who's going to have a platform where the graduate students can either be collected around a specific tool like R or something, or even field-based like bioinformatics or, digital humanities. And then they can become a self-sustaining community here at the University of Alberta and not rely on just submit a ticket and, somebody will get back to you in 4 hours to help you with why you couldn't log in or, nonsense like that. So
I really like that idea. I've seen a couple places where they actually, very much like what you're talking about, they'll say, let's bring together people who are doing image analysis. And they'll actually have then everything from the AI to the astronomers to the health people who are all looking at problems and realize, oh, you guys have found a way because you had to look at stars and I could use it to look for cancers. And, those kinds of discussions, I think, are often really exciting to watch.
Yeah, the other thing is just making people aware that we're out here. I don't know if it's a large school problem specifically, but I have researchers, including our new VPR, who's been in place for a year, who had no idea that we existed and have been in the habit of buying, $20,000 computers to perform her research, her graduate students to perform her research. And all along, that was money she could have spent on half a grad student. So getting it out in front of the community, which is what, Annalie and I were talking about in the chat, making sure people are aware that you're out there is half the battle.
Other than the very smallest institutions, I've heard that from almost everyone. Yeah, the quote that I heard recently was, they were in a department meeting where there was 40 faculty and 3 of them were aware of the campus research computing program. And it was kind of ridiculous.
One of the things that help on that, by the way, which comes back to kind of the purpose of this, is having that discussion with deans. It was transformative at the U of A for me to be able to go to the Dean of Science and say, last year, your researchers that are aware of us did $2.25 million worth of research on the systems that you didn't pay for, you didn't host, they don't show up on your budget, they don't show up on your financial reporting, they don't show up on your space allocation. But can you imagine those people coming to you and asking for $2.25 million more in the budget cuts that we've been through? And she's like, oh my God, I'll get the word out.
So that's, those kinds of stories and approaches, and how did people effectively get the word out and who did they talk to? I've heard different folks tell sort of anecdotally, oh, well, what we did is we went to this, maybe it was the first faculty meetings, or maybe it was graduate student onboarding, or, hire a grad student just to go and talk to their peers, or, whatever. I think having more stories about how you did that, that communication and outreach is obviously a big part of what we try to figure out for our program. So that's a really, I think that's probably a great topic to explore and hear what people have done that worked well. And to be honest, things that didn't work well. There was a really good cloud computing community group talk at Internet 2 recently. This was Internet 2 is connected with EDUCAUSE doing this thing, but they basically said, bring your horror stories of using the cloud. And it was incredibly interesting and useful to hear, things that went really badly, usually associated with cost overruns and things like that. But sometimes those what went wrong stories are also really educational. Thank you, Jonathan, for saying marketing. I used to wind up all my teams by saying, marketing is not advertising. It's about telling our story. And it's all of us have that job. You want to add anything to that? Okay. For those of you who don't know about Jonathan's newsletter, you should definitely check it out. I like what Lisa was saying about reframing the discussion in terms of pain points. What are some of the other pain points that people are facing that they would like to get some help on or have somebody to talk to about?
One thought is the idea of return on investment. Campus investments in these areas are important, trying to leverage the investment from faculty, research grants, but also getting money from the university. How do you quantify that? How do you compare that with other institutions? What are the best leverages or soft spots that you can use to help get visibility for these investments in return? Is it cycles? I don't think so. Is it the research dollars? That's one component. Is it the impact on teaching and research and the intersection there? What are the metrics that people are using, and how do we build some consensus around those and power behind them across a group?
Yeah, and I have to say, I wonder how much of that is a function of some of the other things we've talked about, like where you sit in the organization. Right. Some people are asked to discuss return on investment. Others are able to make the case that's not a meaningful term. We should talk about value on investment. And then, for some that comes around to their impact reporting, but then others say, well, no, I've been, I need to do this. And I wonder, as we gather these stories, some of it is understanding, okay, well, what kind of institution and leadership were you working with, and why did that work well for you? Because I do think we won't find a best practice. I think some of what we're going to be exploring is, okay, how do we understand how to, what the cultural context is that we're operating in, and how do we find matches to that? I don't know what the answer is to that, but I've been scratching my head in terms of when we build resources for the Nexus, for example, how do we make the resources discoverable in a way that's effective for different kinds of institutions?
It's easy to benchmark equipment, but it's harder to benchmark impact.
Yeah,
and I'm trying to find a way to find some metrics or power behind those impact measurements. publications, faculty research, recruiting, all the various other components. That's going to vary by institution, but a group like this might be helpful to come up with some sort of research technology or research related metrics that we could agree on and try and push forward, or at least have some standards to say, it's important to other institutions. Here's what we're doing here. Value this.
And it's those stories. What worked for you? And Kirk,
it's all stories.
It varies from institution to institution. It varies from person to person, right? If you're talking to somebody who's like a vice provost for faculty, they care about recruitment and retention. If you're talking to a CFO, you want to talk more in terms of numbers. And that's part of it, is figuring out, okay, who are those people and how do you influence different roles? Other pain points or ideas? I also see there's a lot of really good discussion happening in the chat. We'll capture that before we go.
Maybe I'll just throw one more out there, which is a given. We're all doing it now, which is fostering multi-institution collaboration.
Yeah, there's recently I've been working with some folks who, the researchers all know that they want to collaborate, and they're struggling with getting the tools in place. There might be a Microsoft shop, and it turns out that it's really hard to enable collaboration in a Teams environment across the institution, depending on how their IAM is set up. And they can actually be fairly mundane things like that, but they drive people nuts when they can't easily share resources. Or figuring out how to build a Globus-based data portal for sensitive data and control access on that. And that's one where, I think in some cases it would be really fun is to go to some of the other tracks and say, like, where does strategy and policy meet data? And, look at what some of the things that they're doing all kinds of interesting stuff around that, and say, well, what support would you need from your leadership or from somebody thinking on the strategy and policy side to support what you're doing? And we may have some interesting collaborations across the tracks there as well. I saw Bob put in something about the implications of where you report in terms of getting tools together. And yeah, how do you get influence over the IAM support when you don't report up to the CIO?
Yeah, I'll add to that also. It's really speaking to what is the value of research computing and how does that fit into the priorities and goals of the school. Certainly, we've talked a lot about here at Harvard, some IT group or some RC groups report into IT, some report into the research provost. And so, especially if you're not in the IT groups, how does your needs, your goals align or fit into those with IT and gain equal footing, especially if you're trying to partner with them. So I think it's a significant challenge.
Yeah, classic leadership thing. How do you have influence when you don't have a reporting line? Scott, yes.
Even when you do report to the same CIO, a lot of times I spend a significant amount of time explaining how what I do isn't 5 nines service provision, et cetera, and the flexibility is more important. The support touch level is more important than cold, tickets and the like. So, a lot of times, because we're up in Canada too, the delivery is completely different. And universities are so inwardly focused about my budget, my faculty, my college, the people that report into me. And I'm like, I don't even live in that, you are one place. And even though you're a top 5 institution in the country, you're not the center of the universe. Like, you spend your day looking at it. And so I have to explain, no, my people report to me institutionally, but they're team leads in a lot of cases on national teams. So, the entire approach for me with my colleagues who are, the director of teaching and learning technology or the data centers, networks, et cetera, is a completely different topic. Even my income from how I fund my staff is different than everyone else. So I'm always setting that context. So sometimes just reporting to the CIO isn't the solution.
Absolutely, especially when you need a quick solution and they're thinking about, okay, can we run this sustainably as a service? And you say, no, we just need a quick and dirty solution for right now. If it turns out to be useful, we'll figure that out then. But we need to be more agile. Henry.
Well, following up to that, I think one of the issues is whether you report to the CIO or to the VPR or some other structure, it's important to be able to explain to your enterprise IT colleagues the differences between research computing versus enterprise IT. And I think if you can articulate that in a way that they find compelling, then they're likely to be much more understanding. So I'm part of the central IT organization. My boss wants us to collaborate more with our fellow IT teams. We're very excited to do that, but we also need them to understand how we differ. So the first time that our operations team, our enterprise operations team, sat in on one of our meetings, I took some time to explain that we support 600 different applications. And understanding how enterprise IT folks support an application and how that wildly differs from how a research computing group supports an application that was really, really hard for them.
Yeah.
Because where they come from to support an application means you have experts about that application on your team. So we have a banner team and we have a PeopleSoft team. We certainly do not have a LAMPS team. We certainly do not have a WARF team.
Right. Well, and it's a really good point in terms of what are the goals and metrics for success for each individual service. I also want to be really careful that while many of us are coming from R1s where the research, computing, and data teams may well be largely separate from the enterprise IT teams, in many places, especially smaller schools, it's the same folks. And so we need to be careful to not describe ourselves as different people or different fundamental capabilities, but different goals and needs in the context of the different work we do. A lot of smaller schools, same people that support classroom systems are supporting research, computing, and data. And in one context,
it's actually not even limited to smaller schools.
Yeah.
I think even the top money makers in the country, the Johns Hopkins, the University of Michigan's, you still see something like 2/3 of those institutions research computing reports to the CIO.
But even if they do, it's the issue is one part of your job may be all about stability, security, and reliability. And the other part of your job is about agility and responsiveness and trying stuff quickly. And so we want to distinguish what the goals and the context are and not make it seem like we're not being welcoming to enterprise IT folks, because some of them may not have a lot of experience with research, but they're not really different from us. We're all the same folks. I just want to be careful about that. I worry sometimes that some dyed-in-the-wool research, computing, and data folks feel that they are fundamentally different from enterprise IT, and we're not. We just have different goals and requirements. So, anyway, we're running up against the hour. Please do continue to engage. You can write to the list. We hope to see you all in November for the next discussion. We'll gather up this stuff. We'll try to digest it and distill it a little bit. A lot of good ideas here, and we'll see what we can do to put together some discussion topics on a lot of this stuff. So
excellent.
Thanks everybody very much for joining us. Good discussion today. Good kickoff for our activity.
And thanks everybody for taking notes. Very helpful. All right.
Yes.